Now in this video I want to talk a little bit about security on packages, and if you haven't been over to the CIS security website for benchmarks before, I really do suggest you go over and give it a try in the description that's flashing across the screen right now. So first up, what I want to do is continue on with one of our earlier themes, which is to take an existing package and update it. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and take David's package, and no offense to David, he's actually done a great job with this, and update it in a way that makes it a little bit more secure, or at least the benchmark secure. I mean, there's always going to be new releases and new options, so there's things to improve as always. But for the moment, let's just go ahead and look at the existing code and then maybe some tweaks and changes we're going to make to it. So the first thing we'll do is to have a quick read through. You can see that we download the necessary installation. You've got a pp variable, which in this case he's using for the configuration file. Nothing wrong with that so far. Then we have this part where we add the local sysadmin based on the user variable. I want to go over that in a second as to why that might not be the best option. But everything generally not a problem with that. I mean, there are multiple ways to deal with it, and one of them is that he has this as an input parameter. So you can have it as a switch, and that's not a problem. Now, where there is a problem is depending on how you run this. So if I run it as logged in user, you can see local machine account / my user profile, all good. Everything's totally fine. But if I'm running this package as, let's say, Puppet or Ansible or something else, and that uses, let's say for example, local machine credentials to run the service. So in this case, I'm just going to fire up a ps exec as local system account and run the PowerShell from there, which would help if I actually open the command prompt with admin first. So let's double back and go over that again. What I want to show is that when you run that same variable within local system, you get a different response than you do when you're running it under a user. So the context at which you're running it can be quite important. So here, if we do the same thing but under the machine account, we see that we now get a different result, and that obviously can affect permissions when in the installation script we're saying that that's going to be the quote-unquote SQL administrator. So might not be the best option. Next up, we've got the installation, which here is fine. We've got a silent argument, and then he's relying on the rest of the installation to be done using the configuration.ini file. Now, I don't like that personally, just for a couple of reasons I'm going to touch on in a little bit. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with it because you can have your own configuration. Then those arguments are passed down here, and then eventually those installation arguments are passed to the package installation, which is run with the mounted ISO file that was downloaded earlier, and then after the installation it's unmounted. So logically speaking, this is all fine, and it gives you lots of options because you can have the input parameters on the package itself. So let's start making some tweaks to this. So first up, one of the tweaks I want to make is I'm going to get rid of probably one of the most common problems, which is the whole config ini file. Now, you can configure SQL installation entirely from command line, and to be honest, that's perfectly usable and to an extent gives you more flexibility. So what I'm going to do is say I want to get rid of that config ini file from this configuration, just because for me it doesn't make sense. Why have it around? It's an extra file in the package and it's not dynamic. So we'll get rid of it. Now that means I'm also going to get rid of the switch because we don't need that either. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace it with the equivalent but in a hash table. So now that we've taken out those various parts, I'm going to go ahead and start replacing them with their equivalent in PowerShell. And what I'm able to do with this is also then allow for some other variables to be added. So here's the installation. So these are all the command switches, etc., that would be normally within the ini file. And one of the things here is that I've got a temp DB count as a variable, so I can now actually go up here. I've defined the instance name, so if I wanted I can make that switch as well, which is kind of useful. Sometimes most people don't use named instances, but you see here we have now a dynamic max DOP. So this is our process account, which in an ideal scenario, the number of temp DBs should match the number of processes that you intend to use. So in my case, I've got 4, so I intend to use 4. And rather than hard code it, what I'm going to do here is actually use the get of the WMI, or in this case the CIM instance, which is basically an updated version. It's still the Windows management framework it's coming from. And I'll just show you this chunk of script, how it looks when we run it. And what it does is it's going to go off and get me a process account. So it's going to look at the actual results, and then it's going to populate the dynamic max DOP. And then if I look at my dynamic max DOP, I can see I have a setting of 4. So that will translate during the installation and say, hey, I have a CPU count of 4. So I now have some a little bit of dynamic installation in my installation script, because if my CPU count is 2, it will be 2. If it's 10, it will be 10. I didn't need to hard code that somewhere. It's now going to be completely dynamic, and it will always set up consequently the number of temp DB files relative to the number of processes, unless, and this is where we also see that we have a greater than, so unless it's greater than 8, because after that you start kind of losing it. Now the next one I've got is this GUI ID, because I want to create a password for my system account, but I don't want it to be static. So I'm going to create a unique GUI ID, and that GUI ID is then going to be got rid of later on, because I'm going to disable the SQL admin account. So it doesn't really matter, but the best part of it being unique is the fact that then it's effectively unhackable. I can't be asked for the password, and it's not written down anywhere because it's uniquely generated every time the package runs. And since that's an account we plan to disable for security reasons anyway, as per best practices, it doesn't really pose much of a problem that we don't know what the password is. Now, once that is done, we can finally get on to the last part, which is all the kind of the post-installation scripts. So what we've got now is some arguments, so we just need to pass our arguments in here. And instead of having them as a separate line down there, what I'm going to do is take them up to the package table here. So we've got our silent arguments being passed. Let's just check that this looks right. Yes, it does. Okay, good. So the silent arguments are being loaded into arguments, and then silent arguments, I'm just going to put this in, and that's going to replace the silent arguments in the hash table below. And we now effectively have everything that we need. So this is the installation now complete, but with a bit of dynamic steps to it. So what we can do now is just again one final check that I didn't miss something, and now we can look at the post installation steps. So here we also have a path. This is a nice option. So you can specify the ISO path if you have a local one. You know what, I'm not going to use that, so I'm going to get rid of it. So everything here that you see that's related to giving the option for the path as an input variable, and then setting it, I'm just going to get rid of this. So take out those lines. So yeah, that looks a little bit cleaner after we're done with this. Let's just take out that last bit there. That's not needed. Okay, good. Now what we've got is a little bit of a tidied up version, and we're just going to have the download from the URL above. Now if you're doing this, usually the URL would be your local repository, so it shouldn't be a problem, because it's a package that you're going to be maintaining. Now let's get to the post installation. We're going to say post install steps, and let's start with the most basic or first one, which is to go ahead and effectively set the security around it. So this is where the hardening element of this starts to come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my dependency, which is I'm going to use PowerShell modules. So in this case, I'm going to use the SQL module. I know that that has a dependency on Nuggety, so I'm going to force the installation of Nuggety if it's not already there. If it's there, it's not a problem. If it's not there, I'm going to force it, and then it's going to install the module, and then I'm going to import the module. Now I'm also going to set some other things. So I'm going to set the hidden instance. I'm going to change the number of log files. I'm going to set the SQL port, and I'm going to set the startup trace flags. These are all stored in the registry, so I'm going to push them as registry key entries. Although realistically, you could also use WMI to go in and change these variables directly on the SQL. I'm going to go with the registry key simple because that's actually quite easy to read. Next, we're going to set the memory values. So just like we set the CPU, we have here a memory. So we're going to set the max memory based on the amount of system memory, based on the calculation. And then we're just going to quickly use this TSQL statement with the variable to tell SQL to use that amount of memory. Now, as you can see at this point, we're still using the SA and we're still using our uniquely generated password. So we haven't disabled the SA account yet. What we're going to do now is in the next step, try and get rid of the SA account. So here we have the query where we say, okay, we're going to disable remote access. We're going to remove guest from ModelDB, and we're going to rename the SA to SQL admin, and we're going to disable the SQL admin. All right, so we now have at the end of this part a disabled SA account. So next up, we're going to then change the registry switch. So we're going to switch it over to login mode to value 1. That means Windows authentication only. And then we're going to restart the service. So this is going to reflect with our instance name above. And once the service is restarted, it will then be forced effectively into Windows mode only. You won't be able to use a SQL login to log in with. And for me, that means that this is now a very secure package. Now, if you're obviously using SQL authentication, you might not want to do that last step. But for most of us, SQL authentication is something that's a little bit flaky unless you've got all the policy settings enabled, and then you've got the question of if the account gets locked out and other things. But that's a different consideration and a lot more detailed to go into. So for the moment, we've effectively created our package. So now we're going to go ahead and we need to turn these files into a Chocolatey package. So if you've been following with previous videos, that's relatively easy. We just need to do a choco pack. So you navigate to the directory, and after we've navigated the directory, we can just simply run the choco pack from there, and that will create the file that we can start testing with. Now, the important thing to remember is that it's always good to test after you've made these kind of changes, particularly the number of changes that we just made, because that was not a small change. That was more than half the file was rewritten one way or another. So doing a quick install is usually a good idea to confirm that the package is functioning, that there's no typos. If there are dependencies that you don't remember or not aware of, you can then find that out. So here we've got an installation error, and I don't know if you can see it clearly enough, but basically it's telling me I don't have .NET 4.6 installed. So I've got a dependency here that I need to rectify. Also, just to prove it, you can do the install without the actual file name. You can just use the package name, and you'll see the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and basically bump off camera for a second, because I'm not going to make you sit through me installing all the dependencies. So I'm going to go ahead and just install the Choco package for .NET 4.6.1, and when that's finished, I'm going to pop back and we'll see where we are, and then we'll continue with checking whether there's any other dependencies or other things that are potentially open or a problem with this file. So I'm just going to let that run on, and I'll get back to you in a moment. So here we are back again. It's been about 20 minutes. There was a couple of Windows patches that were also outstanding that required a reboot, so I had to go ahead and restart the machine So let's get back to our Chocolatey package. Now .NET 4.6 I think it was has finished installing, which was our original blocking package. I'm just going to check that our Chocolatey package is up to date, so I can pack it again, it's not a problem. And then I'm going to go ahead and basically trigger the installation and see if we have any other dependencies or other outstanding things. One of the things that is kind of important is map out your dependencies, and I must admit, if you're running something like Puppet or Ansible or other parts, it actually helps to have in the development stage a clean machine so that you can find out that these packages are missing. And as an example, here we have another one. Visual Studio Redistribution 2017 is apparently also required. So I'm going to go ahead and install that, because naturally we need as many as we do. And that has a dependency on another file, so okay. Or I can solve it this way. I know that these packages are not required all of the time unless you have certain integration elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my package, and I'm going to modify it and say, you know what, I don't want to use these prerequisites. So I'm just going to scroll down here. I'm going to find the dependencies line, and I'm just going to take those out. And then I'm going to save it and close it. I'm going to do Choco pack again, and then I'm going to run the install again. And then I know I do not have that dependency, so I can go ahead and just begin my installation. Now hopefully there are no more dependencies that I'm going to run into. If it is, this is going to be a much longer video than I originally planned. But for the moment it looks like everything's running normally and downloads are in progress, so let's see how far we get and if there's anything left. Now, for those of you who might be wondering, no, my internet is not that fast. This just happens to be a slightly speeded up video because I know that SQL installation takes 20 minutes on average, and not counting speed of download. So rather than make you sit through a 2-hour video doing an installation beginning to end, I've sped up the recording here so that we can kind of get through this in about 2 minutes rather than the much longer equivalent. So as you can see, first part is working fine. So in the original script you have the UI going to Microsoft's download and downloading the ISO file, which in this case is 1.44 gig. It will then do a sum check against it, which is potentially all good, and hopefully the sum check will work out fine. And yes, hashes match. Excellent. So we're going to start the installation at this point, and now the SQL installation itself is also not super fast. So again, the video is still running at a faster rate. And we've got an installation error. Now this is always fun because Chocolatey doesn't tell me a lot usually when you have these kind of errors. Fortunately, the SQL error log, which is always very useful for these kind of things, and I have to admit, is always prominent and right up there when it comes to finding out what happened. So we just got to navigate down the install paths to the logs and then find the summary, and it's going to tell me, oh look, the update folder doesn't exist. So what we've got in my hash table for the installation was a location for any critical updates, UIs, etc. So your cumulative updates folder, now I've got it specified. That folder doesn't happen to exist, so it's got an error trying to find it. So what I do is I'm just going to go back to my package. I'm going to find the line where the update folder exists, which should be pretty close to the bottom. Yep, there it is. And I'm going to take the updates enabled true and the update location and just take those two lines out. So that should then prevent that from being a blocking issue. And again, through the speed of video editing, we're going to speed it up back to the installation step. Now that is the only change that I made at that point, so hopefully we'll go for another run here and we'll see if it finishes this time. Now keep in mind, if the SQL installation fails in terms of that nice big red screen we saw before with all the switches, that means that the installation has failed and therefore SQL components are not installed. The closest you're probably going to have is the SQL client, which is kind of the first thing that's ever installed. So you shouldn't need to do any cleanups or removing of folders, is what I'm trying to say. So with that in mind, we trigger another installation and we don't need to worry about it. Now, alternatively, if something failed at the end in the post installation script, so things like the changing of the SA account, then you've still got SQL installed, but that step has failed. But that's a bit of a problem because your Chocolatey package will not show as being installed because Chocolatey failed because that step failed, which is one of the reasons why people are not keen on mixing the two together between configuration steps and package deployments. And generally this is kind of a bit of a no-no from the community not to do it the way that I'm doing here. But my argument is, why would you deploy a package with anything less than the correct setup? I mean, if it's best practices to do these things, why would you possibly deploy something without it being secure? Makes no sense to me. Now, I'm sure that they'll say, oh, but it should be configured somewhere else. And I'm like, yes, it can be, but why would I do that? I should always have absolutely secure in case something else failed. So our installation is now finished successfully. I can go ahead and check. We have our tempdb. One of the examples here is I want to see I have 1, 2, 3, 4 tempdb files, which matches my number of CPUs, so I know that part of the script definitely ran. I should be able to see my startup trace flags that were added. And if I had Management Studio on this machine, I would be able to show you the rest of the config had also finished. Now, in case you're wondering, all of the configuration is in the comments and up on GitHub, so you can download the script for the package creation yourself and give it a try. And that sums up this rather long video. I'm sorry it took so long. Now, if you like this video, you know what to do. If you didn't like it, you also know what to do. And as always, subscribe for more content.